Hey everybody, so we are moving on to our next unit. This is Unit 7, we call Global Conflict. And it's going to be a lot about what happens during the 20th century, including both world wars. But today we're going to talk about the shifting powers after 1900 and how things have changed, especially in some of those former land-based empires that we've talked about going back all the way to Unit 3. So the um, central question for today is identify and explain how the internal and external factors led to the changes in former land-based empires after 1900. All right, so the language of the curriculum, and let myself out of the way here. There we go. The older land-based Ottoman, Russian, and Qin empires collapsed due to the combination of internal and external factors. These changes in Russia eventually led to a communist revolution. So let's talk about a few of these to begin with. Let's start with the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire, if you guys remember me calling it the sick man of Europe, that's the name it ends up getting. They did not industrialize like the Western European countries did. Nor did they bring a lot of the Enlightenment reforms around the same time that the Western Europe powers did. But later on in the late 19th century, and there is going to be this group of reformers known as the Young Turks. These were young men who went to Western European universities, and of course, there they get exposed to industrialization, modernization, the Enlightenment ideas. And so when they return to the Ottoman Empire, they are going to bring these ideas with them and call for some reforms. They wanted to advocate for a constitution similar to what the European countries do. So rather than the power in the hands of the Sultan, then it would shift more to the power of the hands of the people. But, that's not the only thing they wanted. They did advocate for this idea, this concept of Turkification. And it was an effort to make all the citizens in this very diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, empire that was the Ottoman Empire more identified with the Turkish culture. And so, considering it was a diverse group of people that lived inside the Ottoman Empire, you'll see pushback against this, especially from ethnic groups that identify with Christianity. So we've talked about the Balkans region, how the Balkans are going to rebel against the Ottoman Empire and declare its sovereignty. They also have another group of Christians that roughly 2 million of them lived inside the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the century, known as the Armenians. And the Armenians had difficulties getting behind the idea of Turkification. And, when they didn't fully embrace this idea, some of the young Turks would ultimately scapegoat them and blame them for the economic problems that were existing in the Ottoman Empire. And unfairly, too, because there is a number of reasons for why the Ottoman Empire was struggling economically, and that was largely because they failed to industrialize and keep pace with European powers. And so, again, that's why they're the sick man of Europe, right? So the Ottoman Empire is dealing with these kind of internal problems to start with, and the fact that they keep losing territory to these revolutions that are happening, that are fueled by nationalism in the Balkans region. Many of the Ottomans are also very resentful of the British and the French, and so the British and the French. Their trade policies had, certainly were set up to benefit themselves and not to help benefit others. And the Ottomans despised this. And the same thing, where the British and the French both had control of Egypt at some point, which was kind of supposed to be Ottoman territory. So there's quite a few things kind of going on there as far as external factors go. But this resentment does lead to the Ottomans creating a secret alliance with the Germans. And the Germans were kind of the opposition to the French and British in Europe. And when World War I breaks out, as we'll talk about in our next topic, they are going to have a split government over whether or not to join the war. But ultimately, they do. And the goal, the thought was that if the war was won, And they believed in the strength of the German powers and the Austro-Hungarian empires to be able to defeat the French and British in hopes that they could regain territories they had been losing and control over places like the Balkans and other things. This was kind of their last ditch effort to help bring Ottoman Empire back from total collapse. But the Central Powers, who made up the Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottomans, lost the war. And after they lost the war, the unfair treaty of the Treaty of Versailles would end up punishing the Ottomans and basically would dismantle their empire and break it up into multiple parts. And the map that you see today in the Middle East is largely based on the boundaries of that dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. And then they were occupied by the British for a short period of time. But in 1921, they revolted against the British, and by 1923, a Turkish nationalist would take control of the government and establish what is now known as the Republic of Turkey, led by a guy named Mustafa Kemal, who is the person in the photograph here. And he's also affectionately known as Ataturk, which essentially means father of the Turks. And under his government, they saw the secularization of their government, meaning that they would separate the church, the laws of the church and the laws of the land, similar to what Europe does with theirs. But of course, Islam would still play a heavy influence on things that do occur in Turkey. So that's one thing. They promoted public education. They expanded suffrage to include women as well. So a lot of those Enlightenment ideas that the Young Turks had been pushing for earlier on, will find their way into the new Republic of Turkey. And Turkey today is still one of the most westernized states within the Middle East itself. All right, then we move to Russia, and I wish we had more time to talk about Russia. But this is a survey course, and I've got to give you really the basics as it is. And the whole Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution is years in the making, going back to all the way to Peter the Great, really. So, but anyway, Russia is going to be a country that's slow to modernize comparatively to the rest of Europe. They don't expand education to include people of the peasant class. They do not build infrastructure to the same degree as European states were doing. So that's your roads, that's your telegraphs. I mean, they built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was an accomplishment in itself, but not nearly enough to really make that much of a difference. And kind of when you compare it to the rest of the European states, that what they were doing. They were slow to support private entrepreneurship, and they were slow to allow civil liberties for their citizens. And so on Bloody Sunday, which was a day where working class people marched to gain better wages and things that you expect that working class people would want, the soldiers that the Tsar had under his control opened fire onto the demonstration and killed some 1,300 people. And so, Tsar Nicholas II, who will be the last Tsar of the Russian Empire, he gets labeled as kind of the enemy of the working people. And, there's a short revolution, Revolution 1905. It fails as the strength of the armies of the Tsar are too much at that point for any revolution to stick. But some leaders do come out of that. One is the guy in the bottom of the picture there. His name is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin would be forced to he was exiled or forced to flee into exile, I should say, would be a better way of putting it, in Germany. And he will return at some point. Meanwhile, you've got a bunch of internal problems that are also occurring inside of Russia. And they lost the Crimean War to the British and the French. They lost it to the Ottomans with the support of the British. They lost the Russo-Japanese War and lost a big chunk of their territory on the eastern coast. And then when World War I broke out, Russia is going to be a major player in this. And when the war breaks out, it doesn't go very well for Russia. They're losing lots of men, lots of ground to Germany and to the Ottomans to a lesser extent. And so, a lot of people blamed Tsar Nicholas for the poor state of the country. Not to mention that, the resources that were being harvested and built by the working class people of Russia was being used towards the war effort, leaving them with very little to none. And so, people desperate, starving, needing change, there's going to be a revolution. Germany, who's in a war with Russia, sends Lenin back to Russia to stir up trouble. It's effective, it works. And ultimately, a revolution does take place known as the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks were the revolutionaries that wanted to kind of overthrow the system of Russia and to put in place essentially a communist government, a government that would establish the idea of collectivization and basically collective ownership of production agriculture. So everyone knows everything, and this is the ultimate goal of communism is to create total equality between the people. No more class systems. The working class and then the other classes of people would all be considered equal. And even though that's kind of the intention of it, you can make an argument that never fully pans out the way they intend. But that's a different discussion for a different time. But the bottom line is the Russian Empire goes from being ruled by the Tsar for a very long time. The Tsars were essentially the last major monarchs in Europe to the world's first communist government. Tsar Nicholas himself is killed as well as a lot of his family. For those of you who grew up and watched the movie Anastasia, I'm sorry to say that Anastasia did not escape, and she was killed with the rest of her family too. But that's what happens to the Tsar and his family, and in this place comes the Red Army, led by Vladimir Lenin and others. But that's the Russian Revolution. Then we finish off with the last of the land-based empires, the Qin dynasty. And so the Qin dynasty we've talked about for a while is having a lot of internal problems. And we talked about the Opium Wars. We talk about opium crisis that's going on in their country, the Taiping Rebellion, which you read about in chapter 19. All of these things are going on. And China and the Qin dynasty is slowly losing, power and control over their territories. And this is not something that was new and all of a sudden happened. It's just there had always been internal problems and such. There were ethnic tensions. If you recall, the Qins were a different ethnic group than the majority of China. They were the Manchus from Manchuria, and they ruled over, despite being the minority of the population, they ruled over the Han dynasty or the Han people, and that ethnic group in China. So there's a lot of tensions, and a lot of people never fully accepted them as legitimate rulers because they were considered foreigners. You also have famine that's going on, where China's population had always been increasing for decades and such, centuries, better way of putting it. But they also were susceptible to things like drought. And so when things like that happened, there were so many mouths to feed and just not enough food to go around. There was large scale famine. And, considering the history of China, when things like droughts and famine happen, it tends to make it so that you lose the mandate of heaven and people start to believe that they have the right to revolt. On top of that, China had very low taxes when you compare them to the rest of Europe, and this led to a lot less money for them to build infrastructure projects. And China did not modernize. They did not invest money into the industrialization of their country in the same way like a country like Japan did. And this is going to put them further behind, which leads them to being, pushed around and influenced by foreign powers, which we talked about, the European spheres of influence that come into China and continue to do so into the 20th century. But in 1911, there's a revolution that is going to overthrow the Qin dynasty, and it's going to, instead of creating a new dynasty in the dynastic cycle, establishes a republic led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And the basic principles of his republic were going to be democracy, nationalism, and livelihood. So these were like the three pillars of it. So democracy, power to the people; nationalism, loyalty and patriotism for the country; and then livelihood, to promote economic growth and things like that. The Dr. Sun Yat-sen is still very much a revered historical figure within Chinese. Even though they're a communist government now, they still honor him as the father or the founder of the modern China. But he was never able to fully gain control of the country. He didn't have the military backing to be able to do that. And so he constantly was dealing with regional warlords, wrestling for control over the territory in China. And so civil war will happen for several decades. It gets paused in World War I after World War II after the Japanese do invade China. And so there's a great deal of like history here that I'm definitely oversimplifying, but ultimately, his government will lose out to the communist ruler, Mao Zedong, later on, and Mao Zedong will take control of the country and establish a communist government in China, one that still exists in China today to some extent. All right, so enough of the land-based empires. One of the other things that is part of this unit is kind of what happens in Mexico. And so states around the world challenge existing political and social orders, including the Mexican Revolution that arose as a result of a political crisis. So we're going to focus on Mexico. There are other challenges, but we're going to focus on Mexico just for today. I am right in the way of Emilio Zapata. Okay. So Mexico was under the rule of a dictator for a very long time towards the end of the 19th century. And under the rule of Porfirio Diaz, he is, going to be very favorable to foreign investors who will essentially he gives away the rights to much of Mexico's natural resources, oil in particularly. But the 1% of the entire population of Mexico own 90%, 97% of the land. So this great amount of how do I put inequality within Mexico is definitely an internal factor that is going to lead to a revolution. But 1910, Diaz is going to jail Francisco Madero, who was his opposition in the election. And this is kind of the thing that does spark the Mexican Revolution. And so eventually Madero is able to escape jail, and he is going to flee to the United States, and particularly the border town of El Paso, Texas, where he sets up a revolutionary office and begins kind of to coordinate a revolution within the state of Mexico. And he had people helping him militarily and such. The leader of his armies and his troops was a guy named Francisco Villa, also more commonly referred to as Pancho Villa. But Diaz is going to eventually be exiled. And then a series of conflicts for control and leadership and such in Mexico will ensue from 1910 to about 1930 in entirety. So, lots of political, economic, social instability that's occurring in Mexico during that period of time. But there are some major changes that come about. A revolution means like there's a lot of change, right? And so some of the major reforms that did happen, one of the revolutionary leaders, Emilio Zapata, would end up redistributing land rights more equally amongst the people of Mexico. There's a new constitution that comes about in 1917 that gives people land rights. It gave people universal suffrage. It also establishes public education. So some good stuff come out of this, but the conflicts themselves were pretty deadly. Roughly 2 million of the 15 million people that lived in Mexico at this era did die from these conflicts and revolutions. But out of it came some things that were important in helping Mexico continue to modernize. And there was a new political party that came about. It's the Institutional Revolutionary Party. But they ruled over every president in Mexico until 2000, from 1910 to basically 2000. Was a member of this party, and it became known for being incredibly corrupt as well. So Mexico is still dealing with a lot of internal issues, as every country does. But this is what happens in Mexico during the 20th century in a nutshell. All right, there we go. So that's it for this part of the lecture. Next, we will talk about the causes of World War One. So identify and explain how internal and external factors led to the changes in the former land-based empires after 1900. So make sure you submit this on Canvas, and I will see you all later.